He was putting me down. He says, I wouldn't this dollar bill, because we were playing for dollar bills. And he says, hell, I wouldn't touch anything less than $100 bills. And I said, well, no. He says, come on, you're chicken coward.
Every outlaw needs an enemy, and Jack Elam had his. But this wasn't a movie. This was personal. Behind the crooked glare and villain's laugh, Elam's heart burned with resentment for one man. A rivalry that haunted him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Everyone remembers the crooked glare and gun-slinging menace, but almost no one knows the quiet twists, backdoor deals, and the shocking truth behind Jack Elam's rise. Before the world saw a villain, Hollywood insiders saw something entirely different, and it changed everything. Legends of imagined rivalries, Jack Elam's make-believe feuds. Looking back on Jack Elam's long career, one thing stands out. He wasn't the kind of actor who made enemies, and every director, co-stars, and crew members painted the same picture of him. According to everyone he worked with, he was professional, easygoing, and a lot of fun on set. He understood his role in the grand scheme of Western storytelling as the bug-eyed villain who could steal a scene with nothing more than a twitch of his face or a muttered line. Still, it's hard not to imagine what it might have been like if Elam had carried grudges or quietly nursed rivalries against some of the great leading men of his time. Take James Stewart, for instance. In various films, he embodied the noble everyman, the hero who brought order to towns on the brink of chaos. Elam, on the other hand, thrived as the slippery outlaw, the character audiences knew wouldn't survive past the second act. It is tempting to imagine Elam quietly keeping score, tallying each time Stewart's virtue triumphed over his villainy, as if the squinty outlaw were plotting revenge against Hollywood's favorite hero. Charles Bronson is another name you might imagine Jack Elam couldn't stand. Let's recap why that might be. One of Elam's most memorable appearances came at the start of Once Upon a Time in the West. The movie kicks off on a dusty train platform, sun beating down, and Jack Elam sitting with two other hired guns. He doesn't move much, but you can't take your eyes off him either. At one point, he plays with his pistol, and when a fly lands, he slips it into the barrel and traps it, letting the insect buzz and rattle like it's stuck in a tiny cage. The silence stretches, the tension builds, and then, out of nowhere, a rider shows up. It's Charles Bronson. He comes in calm, steady, like a man who already knows he owns the moment, and within seconds, shots ring out, causing the waiting men to drop before they even knew what hit them. The sudden burst of violence shatters the slow build, and Bronson walks away with the scene and the audience in his pocket. You can almost picture Elam later, half joking and half annoyed, saying, "I had that scene," and then Bronson waltzed in. John Wayne offers another interesting angle. He was the towering figure in Westerns, and in Rio Lobo, which aired in 1970. Jack Elam played a character named Phillips, who is eccentric, rough around the edges, and fits Elam's familiar rogue style. So imagine Wayne, serious and steady, grounded in his role as Cord McNally, working with Elam, who might throw off a wisecrack between takes or carry himself in his usual quirky, unpredictable way. Maybe Wayne, focused on precision, found Elam's antics a bit too loose, or maybe Elam, watching Wayne's strict approach to every scene, quietly rolled his eyes or made a sarcastic remark. Could that kind of contrast have built into rumored tension or a friendly rivalry behind closed doors? And what about James Garner, whose charm was effortless? He had that sly smile and quick wit that carried him through Support Your Local Sheriff. Elam, by contrast, was the visual punchline, the unpredictable outlaw who made audiences laugh or wince in equal measure. One could imagine Elam watching Garner get top billing and wondering why his own face, so instantly recognizable, never landed him the star treatment. Did he ever feel slighted? Did he ever wish he could trade places, just once, to be the hero instead of the outlaw or the scoundrel? But before we talk about who Jack Elam may have truly despised, we first need to uncover how a one-eyed accountant became Hollywood's most unforgettable villain. The one-eyed accountant who became Hollywood's most unforgettable villain. Jack Elam never looked like a man born for Hollywood stardom. He was born William Scott Elam in Miami, Arizona, a dusty mining town where kids grew up tough and work was found where you could get it. Jack's early life was filled with odd jobs, and one of the first ways he earned money was in the cotton fields. Despite the heat being brutal and the hours ridiculously long, the pay was barely enough to scrape by. However, that was where the seed of his work ethic was planted. Before he even set foot on a film set, Jack already knew what it meant to put in hard labor, to push through discomfort, and to carry on even when the odds looked stacked against him. At just 11 years old, Jack's life took a dramatic turn. While in a scuffle with another Boy Scout, a pencil struck his left eye, leaving him permanently blind on that side and giving his gaze a crooked, unsettling look. For most, such an accident would have been a devastating setback, but for Jack, it became an unlikely blessing. What might have made others recoil instead became Jack's unmistakable calling card. Hollywood titan Darryl Zanuck once advised him not to fix it, as it was part of his mystique. His crooked stare gave him an edge no acting class could ever provide, making him unforgettable in an industry built on faces you couldn't forget. Oddly enough, acting wasn't Jack's first ambition. After leaving Arizona, he went to California to study business, and soon he was putting that talent to work as an accountant. He wasn't crunching numbers for small-town shops either. He worked for some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including studio boss Samuel Goldwyn. Elam knew the industry, though not from the stage lights or camera angle, but from the ledgers and bottom lines. For years, it looked like that would be his life until fate dealt him another hand. His eyesight, despite already being compromised, began to decline further, making it impossible to continue the meticulous work of accountancy. Faced with the loss of the only career he had trained for, Jack could have given up. But instead, he did something bold. He set his sights on a new dream, one that seemed impossible for a man with no acting experience, no leading man looks, and an eye condition that might have ended most auditions before they began. Jack Elam was going to the movies. Of course, Jack didn't just stroll into a casting office and land a role. His path into Hollywood was as crooked as his stare. Drawing on his background as an accountant, he tapped into industry connections and cleverly leveraged them. He began securing financing for low-budget westerns, using business savvy to open doors that raw talent alone never could. The arrangement was straightforward. He helped raise the money, and in return, he earned a part. It was a practical, backdoor hustle that suited Elam perfectly, because he wasn't the type to sit around waiting for luck. He went out and made it. By 1949, his strategy paid off, and he made his debut as the killer in a short called Trailin' West. It wasn't a glamorous start, but it put him on camera and set him on a new path. Within 2 years, he had already carved out his niche, and in 1951, he appeared in Rawhide. Through him, audiences saw something they hadn't seen before. Elam's face, his voice, and above all his eyes gave him an aura of menace that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't a traditional cowboy hero, but he was unforgettable as a villain. The beauty of Elam's rise is that none of it seemed destined. He was just a boy from a dusty Arizona town, half blind from an accident, who first built a life as an accountant before transforming into one of Hollywood's most distinctive screen villains. His story reads like a Western itself. A man reinventing himself when the safe road ran out, gambling on risk when circumstance left him no choice. His journey from the cotton fields to the film sets was anything but smooth. It was messy, uncertain, and at times desperate, and that's exactly what makes it so compelling. He had clawed his way from ledgers to movie sets, but the question remained, what roles would define him? The answer would cement Jack Elam as Hollywood's most unforgettable villain. Jack Elam's signature roles. When audiences in the 1950s pictured a Western villain, one face stood out above all others. Crooked-eyed, wiry, and wearing a sly grin that unsettled everyone in the room, Jack Elam was the man no hero could ignore. Westerns dominated the era, filling movie theaters and television screens alike, and whenever a bank was robbed, a wagon train ambushed, or a saloon brawl erupted, Jack Elam's shadow was never far behind. This was because Hollywood directors knew his presence added weight to a story. In 1952, Fritz Lang casted him in Rancho Notorious, and that same year Fred Zinnemann also casted him in another classic, High Noon. The audience barely needed an introduction, because at this point in his career they knew the moment Jack appeared, trouble had entered the frame. His eyes, his voice, his whole bearing told the story without a single line of dialogue. By the mid-1950s, his place in the pantheon of bad guys was already cemented. Richard Brooks put him in Vera Cruz in 1954, and Anthony Mann also casted him in The Far Country that same year. His villainy had no moral compass, no excuse, and no hidden trauma. They were simply bad, and Jack never tried to soften them. In John Sturgis's Gunfight at the OK Corral, he played Tom McLaury, and once again the crooked grin made the villain unforgettable. It wasn't about long speeches or theatrics. It was about the little things, like the way he leaned on a bar, the way his eye twitched as if sizing you up, and the way he let silence linger before striking. By the late 1950s, reporters began to call him the screen's most loathsome character. And while this was a strange badge of honor, Elam wore it proudly. Westerns of that era needed Jack Elam. Heroes looked taller, braver, and stronger when they had him to stand against. If Gary Cooper walked tall, it was Elam lurking in the corner that made it matter. If Burt Lancaster drew his gun, Elam's presence made the moment crackle with tension. His name appeared in more than 50 westerns, a consistency that was no accident. It came from a man who knew exactly what his role was and delivered it every time. Audiences may not have remembered the names of every character he played, but they remembered the face, and that was enough. In nearly every episode, he ended up on the losing side, gunned down, outsmarted, or dragged away by justice. Yet the repetition never grew stale, because Elam found new shades of menace each time. He wasn't a star in the traditional sense, but he became indispensable to the fabric of American Western storytelling. What made Jack's run as the ultimate villain remarkable is how much he embraced it. Some actors spend their careers fighting typecasting, but Elam leaned into it. He knew he wasn't a matinee idol, and he didn't need to be. He gave audiences exactly what they came for, and Hollywood rewarded him with steady work. His filmography of the 1950s and early 1960s reads like a catalog of Western classics, and in each one, he played his part so convincingly that even the briefest appearance carried weight. Yet, As much as Jack Elam became the gold standard for screen villains, something surprising happened as the 1960s rolled on. From heavies to hilarity, Elam's comedic turn. By the late 1960s, the Western itself was changing. Audiences wanted something lighter, and filmmakers were finding ways to poke fun at the very genre that had once been played straight. Jack Elam, whose career had already been built on menacing scowls, suddenly found himself being recast as the punchline, and it was Burt Kennedy who first spotted the potential. In Support Your Local Sheriff, which aired in 1969, Elam played a cantankerous deputy opposite James Garner, and for the first time, audiences were laughing at the same face that had once made them shudder. The comedy didn't come from him reinventing himself, but from exaggerating what people already expected. His eye, which was once a symbol of danger, now became a comic weapon. The way he shifted his gaze, the way he leaned into lines with that crooked smirk, all worked together as humor, as well as it once had as menace. 2 years later, Kennedy brought him back for Support Your Local Gunfighter, once again giving Elam a role that made fun of his own villainous persona. It was meta before meta was even a thing. Sly wink to audiences who knew him all too well as the outlaw. His comedy chops showed up again in Howard Hawks' Rio Lobo, which aired in 1970. Elam was casted alongside John Wayne and once again made a comedy out of the very role he used to take seriously. Instead of threatening the hero, he made fun of himself, stealing scenes with exaggerated bumbling and perfectly timed scowls. In family-friendly comedies such as Dirty Dingus McGee with Frank Sinatra and The Villain, which was later released as Cactus Jack, starring Kirk Douglas and featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Elam brought the same goofy edge. Audiences who once saw him as a menacing Western villain were now laughing at his antics. Television also embraced this softer version of him. In the sitcom The Texas Wheelers, that aired from 1974 to 1975, Elam played Zach Wheeler, a long-lost father figure. It was a chance to show warmth in between the crankiness, and he pulled it off with ease. Audiences discovered that beneath the menacing mask was a natural comic timing that seemed effortless, and by the late 1970s, Elam was stepping into absurdist territory. He played Frankenstein's monster in Struck by Lightning in 1979, leaning into broad parody. It was a role so far from his gun-slinging past that it almost felt like a private joke between him and the audience. His comedy roles reached a new peak when Burt Reynolds casted him in The Cannonball Run in 1981 and its sequel. He played the eccentric Dr. Van Helsing, and he turned into a full clown, mugging for laughs in a way that showed just how far he had come. Here was the man once dubbed the screen's most loathsome character, now stealing laughs in blockbuster comedies alongside big names of the new Hollywood era. His career had come full circle, and audiences embraced every turn. Through it all, Elam never pretended to be more complicated than he was. He didn't believe in digging into layers of psychological motivation. Instead, he was straightforward, both on and off the screen, and this honesty carried into his comedy. He didn't play villains as tortured souls, and he didn't play comic roles as exaggerated clowns. He simply leaned into what the audience saw and made it work. Off-screen, that same straightforwardness defined him. Friends recalled that he lived exactly as he appeared, cantankerous in a funny way, a man who smoked, drank, and laughed his way through life without apology. He also had a soft side, and his friendship with Mickey Hayes, a young boy with progeria whom he met on the set of The Aurora Encounter, showed his warmth. Elam supported Mickey through illness, staying in touch until the boy's death, proving that behind the villain's glare and the comic growl was a man with a big heart. What makes Jack Elam's career remarkable is not simply that he played both villains and clowns. It's that he made the transition so seamlessly. Only a few actors could command both menace and laughter with the same crooked eye, but he embodied the Western villain so completely that his face became shorthand for danger. He managed to turn around and use that same face to make people laugh. It was an evolution no one could have predicted, yet it fit him perfectly. In a way, Elam's career reflects the evolution of Hollywood itself. The 1950s demanded clear-cut villains, and he delivered them flawlessly. The 1970s wanted parody and laughter, and he delivered that too. His ability to adapt kept him relevant across decades, and it cemented his place not only as one of the most recognizable faces in Westerns, but also as one of the most beloved character actors in American cinema. And by the end of his career, audiences no longer saw him as the loathsome villain of their childhood. They saw him as an old friend, a reliable presence who could still raise a smile with a crooked grin. He'd conquered villains and mastered comedy, but Jack Elam's real story was just beginning. Behind the scenes lay friendships, loyalty, and a legacy as unforgettable as his crooked grin. Jack Elam's enduring legacy. If you go digging through Hollywood history, you'd expect to find at least a scrap of controversy attached to Jack Elam. After all, this is a man who spent the better part of his career glaring down heroes, robbing banks, and getting shot in dusty saloons. In the movies, he was the outlaw every cowboy had to conquer. Yet, off-screen, the record was oddly quiet. The silence is almost unsettling, especially because it was an industry that thrives on drama. Even after his death, which was a prime opportunity to reveal old secrets, nothing surfaced. Instead, they celebrated him as not only one of the most recognizable faces in Westerns, but also one of the most beloved. The Guardian went as far as calling him one of the best-loved character actors of his kind. The Independent praised his ability to move seamlessly from menace to comedy. Both accounts celebrate a body of work that spanned decades, yet neither mentions a spat worth noting. However, when you look closer, the pattern repeats itself everywhere. Whether it was the set of Fred Zinnemann's High Noon, Anthony Mann's The Far Country, or the television stages of Gunsmoke and Bonanza, Jack seemed to pass through like a professional who came, did the work, and left people smiling. The stories his co-stars told years later weren't about fights or tension, but about the joy of working with a man who never took himself too seriously. Even when he played alongside legends like James Stewart in The Man from Laramie and John Wayne in Rio Lobo, there wasn't a hint of bad blood. If anything, Jack played the kind of supporting role actors love to have nearby. Dependable, colorful, always adding flavor without trying to steal the entire show. The more you dig, the stranger it gets, because Hollywood is full of stories of ego clashes. Directors argue with actors argue with each other, and studios sometimes feed those conflicts to the press because scandal sells. However, Jack Elam seems to have walked right past that chaos without ever getting caught in it. Even the moments where you'd expect trouble, like when he turned down Sergio Leone's offer to play in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it doesn't appear to have caused any lasting conflict. Instead, Leone welcomed him into the fold later with Once Upon a Time in the West, proving there was no grudge on either side. What's fascinating is how different the truth is from the half-stories floating around online today. You'll find his name on those viral YouTube lists about Hollywood feuds you never knew about, usually next to some invented tale that Clint Walker skipped his funeral or that Jack clashed with a co-star on the set of The Night of the Grizzly. Yet, the official record tells the opposite. Jack and Walker were friends who worked together smoothly, and neither ever spoke a negative word about the other. Those so-called feuds exist only in the imaginations of internet storytellers, not in the archives of newspapers or the words of people who actually knew him. So what do we make of this silence? In a world where stars are remembered as much for their temper as their talent, the absence of scandal says more than a juicy headline ever could. Jack's legacy is, in many ways, the legacy of a man who simply got along with people. He was known for his cockeyed glare and villain sneer, but once the cameras stopped rolling, that same face lit up with warmth. Behind that warmth lay a quiet kind of power, a career built not on headlines or feuds, but on sheer presence, the kind that turns bit parts into legend. Jack Elam never won an Academy Award or carried a blockbuster franchise, but what he did have was staying power. He racked up more than 50 films, dozens of television roles, and a reputation so strong that audiences only had to spot his crooked eye in the opening frames to know trouble was coming. When the golden age of westerns faded, Elam didn't stall. He pivoted. He leaned into comedy, and Burt Kennedy's "Support Your Local Sheriff" and "Support Your Local Gunfighter" turned him into the cranky deputy or oddball sidekick who could steal a laugh without effort. In Cannonball Run, he played a lunatic doctor with such glee that a new generation, unfamiliar with his earlier westerns, discovered him all over again. This ability to adapt easily is part of what makes his legacy so enduring. Elam wasn't trapped by his image. He played with it, poked fun at it, and kept audiences guessing right up to the end. By the time he was inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame in 1994, the applause wasn't only for his villainy, it was for the way he carried himself through an industry that often chewed people up. He had managed to create a career filled with memorable characters while living a life that didn't leave behind bitterness or enemies. When he eventually retired to Oregon, the peace he found there was exactly in line with the life people had seen from him for decades. There was no need to dig for skeletons, because there were none to find. What they found instead was a man remembered with affection, someone who, despite spending his career playing the villain, was genuinely good. Even today, when fans stumble across his old performances, they often smile. Jack Elam's legacy was built on laughs, scares, and unforgettable stares. But when it comes to who he truly hated, the answer may be the most surprising twist of all. For a man who played some of the most despised villains in film history, it feels natural to think that the person behind the crooked stare might have carried a few grudges of his own. You imagine him glaring at a co-star across a dusty backlot, muttering under his breath, waiting for the director to yell "cut" so he could settle the score. Yet, when you pull back the curtain on Elam's life, that story doesn't really appear. What you find instead is something stranger, quieter, and perhaps more surprising. If we imagine him hating anyone, it might not have been the co-stars whose names always appeared higher on the marquee. It might have been something bigger, something more abstract. By the late 1960s, Hollywood was shifting. Clint Eastwood was moving from television cowboy to international star. Charles Bronson was headlining films in Europe and then America, and the Western itself was evolving into something grittier and darker. For a character actor like Elam, who had built a career as the go-to heavy, the changing landscape might have felt like a slow erasure. Could it be that his only real enemy was the industry itself? The way it chewed up certain types of actors and moved on without them? Did Elam feel a sting of resentment? A wish that he too could have crossed that invisible line from character actor to cultural icon? There's no evidence he ever said so out loud. He didn't leave behind bitter interviews or angry memoirs. Still, the idea has the texture of a good campfire tale, the kind of myth people tell because it feels possible, even if it isn't provable. And what about directors or editors? They too could be seen as his imaginary rivals. Think about an actor like Elam pouring everything into a scene, only to discover later that it had been cut. The director shrugs, the editor keeps working, and the moment is gone forever. Did he shake his head and curse the decision? Probably. Most actors do at some point. Yet, there are no stories of Elam storming off set or holding grudges over lost screen time. Those who worked with him remembered him as cooperative, professional, and quick with a laugh. Even the biggest stars, the men he lost to on screen, don't seem to have drawn his scorn. James Stewart shot him down in countless westerns. Charles Bronson killed him off in one of cinema's most iconic openings, and John Wayne towered over him in Rio Lobo. Any of these men could have been the answer to the question. Any of them would make for a good story. Yet dig through the record, and nothing surfaces. Instead, you find the opposite. Stewart was admired for his kindness, Wayne respected his supporting players, and Elam himself often spoke warmly of the work he got to do. The grudges we imagine are useful for spinning a tale, but they never made it into the reality of his life. So who did Jack Elam hate the most? The surprising answer is no one. In a business famous for rivalries and bruised egos, Elam seems to have walked a different path. He carried himself with a sense of humor about his roles, an appreciation for the chances he was given, and a willingness to lean into the caricature that made him famous. He didn't waste time on feuds. He didn't leave behind a trail of bitterness. What he left was a legacy of unforgettable faces, quirky moments, and a reputation as one of the most beloved villains Hollywood ever produced. In the end, the absence of hate might be the headline. The story isn't that Elam despised someone more than anyone else. The story is that he didn't. And that might be the biggest twist of all. In a world that thrives on drama, Jack Elam's greatest act of rebellion was choosing not to play along. Do you think his crooked eye glare helped him or held him back? Could he have been an even bigger star if cast as the hero instead of the outlaw? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.